Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. Today's program is part 2 in a series about the economic philosophy of socialism, communism. They're really one and the same, a belief in collectivism, that the state should force individuals to engage in economic activity together under the auspices of government. As I covered in last week's program, people today think socialism is simply government charity or a way to do charity by pooling our dollars together. But read some of the articles by the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. They're calling for the elimination of private ownership of business to be replaced by state-owned corporations. That's Marxism. And they are calling for the government to slowly start buying up all Wall Street stocks so that all corporations legally become government entities. They're calling for the construction of 10 million government-owned housing units. And the ideology of communism is that the government provides the housing. And there's a whole class of people in America who would be more than willing to have the government provide for them a place to live. Now, socialism is a very big, complicated, convoluted issue. I could do a dozen programs on this subject, but there is really a pitfall in doing too much explaining. Because if it takes too many words to defend a position, you automatically lose because of the length of your argument. Not that everything God says is simple, or that everything needs to be reduced to a 10-second soundbite, but the core foundational values behind right and wrong are always simple. It's a devil's philosophy that always appeals to complications. It's the ungodly who always say to the godly, you're being too simplistic. You don't understand all of the nuances of the argument. If socialism is wrong, it shouldn't take 3 hours of lectures to show people that it's wrong. So the fundamental argument against socialism is simply, thou shalt not steal. Period. God has ordained property rights. Micah chapter 2, verse 2, it is the wicked who covet fields and seize them, take them by force, and houses and take them away. They rob a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. And in the words of Jesus, Matthew chapter 20, verse 15, is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is my own? And Jesus also gave the parable of the landowner and the laborers, which is all about rightful ownership of your labor. The point is that God made you, and therefore God owns you. But this principle is illustrated in social economics. Matthew chapter 21, verse 33, there was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a wine press in it and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. But now when the harvest time approaches, the renters thought that the profits and the land belonged to them. Verse 34, when the harvest time approached, he sent out slaves to the vine growers to receive his produce. The vine growers took his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. So eventually, the landowner sends his son to collect. Verse 38, and when the vine growers saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Let us kill him and seize his inheritance. They took him and they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. So this is a workers' revolt. This is a communist revolution. And we can imagine all of the justifications these laborers had as to why the produce and the land should belong to them. Just read the works of Karl Marx. The laborers are being disenfranchised from the work of their hands, that the farm should be owned collectively. But what then does Jesus sanction? Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? They said to him, he will bring those wretches to their wretched end, and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper season. Then in verse 43, Jesus agrees with their conclusion. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. Well, because of this text and many like it, Christians are very keen on the importance of people owning what is theirs. We have a right to our labor. We have a right to invest, to hire, and to reap profits. It doesn't belong to the collective. It doesn't belong to the group. And this parable is a very powerful capitalistic teaching. And this is why Christianity and communism are incompatible, and why communism hates the biblical teaching of property rights. Now, consider the deeper meaning of that parable. God's right to own and to collect. That may be underlying the philosophy of socialism, communism. See, Satan's original argument against God was that even though God created everything, God doesn't have the complete right of ownership. He doesn't have the right to his labors and to his investment. And Satan was arguing, in effect, that God's sovereignty and authority must be shared collectively. He didn't build that. Well, he kind of did build the universe, but that doesn't mean he has a personal right to it. That is the core of Satanism. The devil has taken this resentment and philosophy to earth. A society that is steeped in communist ideology cannot fathom ownership, God's ownership. Ownership and authority is anathema. It's unjust in the communist worldview. And maybe this is why atheism and socialism are bedfellows. There is a subconscious grievance against authority and ownership. You know, the same people who rebel against God's ownership also rebel against all ownership. And the philosophy of hell is what is yours should be mine. So if Jesus in this parable taught that the issue of God's authority is demonstrated in people's economic views of ownership and property rights, then this issue of socialism versus capitalism is a spiritual problem. I was having dinner over at my son's house the other day, and my son asked me, what's this week's God and Country program going to be about? And I said, well, it's part 2 in the series on socialism. And he said to me, Dad, don't forget to remind the people of the tie between atheism and communism. And I really didn't think much about that comment because I had said a few words about that in the radio program. But as I thought about it, that was a very wise statement. Because this is what this is really all about. Communism, socialism, in their hatred of ownership and authority, despise God and God's ways. So property rights, the right to the labor of your own hands, is a core godly biblical ethic in the God-to-man relationship and also in the man-to-man relationship. And again, this is the main argument refuting socialism, property rights. Now, of course, the supporters of socialism are going to come back and claim all sorts of other biblical values in their favor. They're going to say, well, doesn't the Bible also teach that we are our brother's keeper? And shouldn't we be giving charity to the poor? And the government has the right to tax. So the government has the right to take your stuff and give it to someone else. So now all of a sudden, the issue becomes inundated with complications. And this is how Satan works to deceive. By complicating clear biblical mandates. So that people throw up their hands and they say, well, the truth can't be known. Who knows whether life begins at conception? Who knows whether marriage is one man, one woman? And who knows whether God really said, thou shalt not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? So what I'm saying is this. Don't let all of these many varied arguments for or against socialism muddy the simplicity of the error of socialism. Don't lose the forest for the trees. In this series, I want to show you why socialism is unbiblical. But in doing this, I don't want you to lose the main underlying irrefutable argument against socialism. Thou shalt not steal. Personal property rights. As soon as you abandon that principle, you lose the argument against socialism. So I can now read to you the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal, and say that is why socialism is wrong, and this program could be over. But of course, I have to say a bit more. Because as Paul wrote to Timothy, we have to address the complications. We're to exhort with sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict, but still do not let all of these peripheral arguments cause you to lose the main point. So, by way of review, in last week's program, I didn't get very far in explaining the biblical text refuting socialism. I spent 3/4 of the program explaining why the church really needs to address the subject. Because there's always those who say that the Bible has nothing to say about politics and economic systems. I picked up this book from Nav Press a number of years ago, The Biblical Principles in Economics, the Foundations. And one of the chapters, written by a leading evangelical, is entitled, No Economic System Flows Directly from Scripture. And in this piece, he states that since man is a sinner, no economic system is pure. Use whatever system helps the poor the most, and then he goes on to promote socialism. Which is interesting to me that always those who take the modern liberal position are the ones who say that the Bible has nothing to say about the subject at hand, that the Bible has nothing to say about abortion, or that the Bible has nothing to say about LGBT, or that the Bible has nothing to say against socialism, communism. But the Bible does have a lot to say about economic systems. Remember, Jesus spoke quite often about money, because how people use money is a reflection of deeper heart attitudes concerning authority, concerning rights and justice. Remember what Paul told Timothy. The love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. Now, of course, this does not mean that people are falling in love with pieces of paper with pictures of dead presidents. They love the power and the authority money can buy. And they abuse it and they steal it. And they love taking the rightful power and the authority away from others. And so the love of money, the love for power, causes people to come up with evil economic systems to steal from others. Most people would not think about stealing stuff from their neighbor's house. They wouldn't think about walking into their neighbor's garage and stealing things out of their garage. But they will vote for government systems that do the stealing for them, because that's safe. And that comes with a lot of high-sounding justifications. The love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And that includes wars and millions of starving, displaced people. If you haven't noticed, more people were killed in the 20th century than in any other century. And it was mostly over this battle between these two economic systems, capitalism versus communism. Over 100 million people died because bitter, resentful people thought that they had the right to the labor and the property of others. And this battle wasn't just about economics, but the underlying philosophy behind each of these systems. It was a battle between personal rights and government totalitarianism, between freedom and tyranny, between religion and atheism. The two economic systems in question are just byproducts of greater political religious ideologies. Socialism is always part and parcel with totalitarianism. To enforce socialism, you have to limit people's freedom, economic freedom. And socialism, collectivism, always leads the state to take coercive action. People lose their freedoms. And when you lose economic freedom, you lose every other freedom. Alex de Tocqueville, the Frenchman who came to America in the 1830s, he wrote the famous work, Democracy in America. In it, he explains that socialism means slavery. He saw what the Jacobins did in France in the French Revolution. Quote, democracy, as an essentially individualistic institution, stands in irreconcilable conflict with socialism. Democracy extends the sphere of individual freedom. Socialism restricts it. While democracy seeks equality and liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servanthood. Hayek, in his famous book, The Road to Serfdom, quote, political freedom cannot be separated from economic freedom. Once you lose economic freedom, you lose political freedom. There's never been an example in history where people lose economic freedom who don't soon lose political freedom. Economic socialism is the child of political tyranny. Elizabeth Bruning had an article in the Washington Post entitled, "It's Time to Reclaim Socialism from the Dirty Word Category." And one of her arguments, and you'll hear this often, is that this new socialism being promoted is not totalitarian socialism, but democratic socialism. And this socialism will work because we, the people, can vote. We're in charge. But you have to understand that the tyranny of the 51% can be just as evil as the tyranny of Stalin. Because what if the 51% want to keep their slaves in the 19th century? This is what Lincoln was up against. And what if the 51% want to take the wealth from the 49%? We are to be a nation of law, not a nation of populism. Democratic socialism can be tyranny because you give the people the right to steal through government. It invalidates God-given constitutional rights, the right to property. So as I'm reading this article by Elizabeth Bruning, I'm thinking to myself, Bruning, where did I hear that name before? And her husband, Matt Bruning, founded the 3P movement, the People's Policy Project, a think tank for the Democratic Socialists. And he's one of the people calling for the government to buy up the stock market. His democratic socialism is simply old-fashioned communism, where the government controls the economy and owns everything. The Brunings are simply recovering classic socialism communism from the trash can where it belongs. And this whole thing addresses another reason why Christians are alarmed by socialism and why we are opposed to socialism, because of the government control, the inevitable tyranny. And we have Revelation chapter 13 in our Bibles, the biblical prophecy that the Antichrist is going to set up a system of governmental economic control. Revelation chapter 13, verse 16, and the Antichrist causes all to be given a mark on their right hand and on their forehead, and he provides that no one will be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark. Now, you might say that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism, but actually it has everything to do with socialism. The sin described in Revelation chapter 13 is not wearing a 666 tattoo or the creation of a common currency. The sin described in Revelation 13 is the crime of the state taking away people's economic freedom, the right to buy, to sell, and to own the labor of one's own hands. And that control is wrong because it empowers evil people. And Christians must fight against the reestablishment of Babel, Genesis chapter 11, where power is consolidated by central government, both political power and economic power. Genesis 11:6, And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they propose to do will be impossible for them. So if the government has your money, it can decide your health care, your education, your housing, your travel. It can decide who gets the money. And one of the main crimes of socialism is how it empowers the lazy, the undeserving, and the demagogues. Government should never be given such economic power because power corrupts, but socialists kind of refuse to believe in man's propensity toward evil. So anyway, last week was generally about the biblical importance of this whole subject. This week, what I want to do is just say a few words about the personal motivations behind the philosophy of socialism. And I started off talking about the spiritual component. I'm sorry that this material is not more organized. Most of this I put together on the go. I'm not trying to present here a formal academic treatise. Otherwise, I would be more organized. But let's just talk some more about this motivation. What's really amazing to me is that this philosophy of socialism, communism, is becoming popular again. And we wonder, what's motivating this? Because given the history of the 20th century, the atrocities and the failures of the Nazis, the National Socialists, and the failure of the Soviet Union under 70 years of communism, you would think people would have completely abandoned this idea of collectivism. But people are still believing in socialism. It is a political ideology that just doesn't want to die. It keeps deceiving every new generation. And it kind of reminds us that unless we teach godly values to every generation, we're just one generation away from apostasy and tyranny, which is the default position of humanity, sin and ignorance. And another thing that's really bizarre is that we have all of these social leaders talking about the need for socialism when the economy is booming, when employment is the lowest it's been in years. Free enterprise capitalism is working so well. Why are these people complaining? Why do they want something different? Why do they want to remake America? You would think that socialism would only sell in a nation in poverty, but it's being sold in a time of great capitalistic prosperity. Socialism is even being sold in a day when the current experiment in socialism, Venezuela, is collapsing. Just a few years ago, socialists were saying that Venezuela is the poster child for how great socialism is. But now they have to say that, the collapse of Venezuela has nothing to do with socialism. So why is socialism the zombie that keeps coming out of the grave? So let me suggest a few reasons. First, the spiritual dimension. A rebellion against authority and the ownership of others, as I pointed out in the Matthew 21 text. This is really the root. Don't underestimate the grudges, the bitterness, the resentment, the envy motivating socialism. Karl Marx was embittered over the haves and the have-nots. For him, life consisted in the abundance of the things he possessed. As Jordan Peterson wrote, he left socialism because he realized that much of socialist thinking was hatred and envy toward the rich and successful instead of true regard for the poor. In Dinesh D'Souza's latest movie, he explained socialism by showing a man standing outside a restaurant, looking through the window at happy people enjoying their dining experience. And this fellow says to himself, I work just as hard as they work. I should be in there and they should be out here. I need government to settle the score. And that attitude drives socialism. These socialists are the renters in Matthew chapter 21. Let us seize the inheritance of the owner. But here is another motive. Certain people benefit from the power of government. It enriches them. They make their living by collectivism. People who work for the state vote for socialistic policies more than the general public. professors at state universities, public school teachers, workers at government departments all get a paycheck by the power of government to tax, to force other people to pay for their services. The government's power to force everyone to do education together and other services. If people had a choice, these people may not be wanted. So they want their positions secure. They may feel threatened by free enterprise. And the more other people that they can get in the collectivist boat with them, the more safe they feel. They don't probably think very deeply about this, but they do know that socialism, collectivism, seems to work well for them. They have jobs without having to experience the stress of the market. Most people know that private sector jobs are a lot more difficult. And so they also feel some guilt. And they tend to think that it might be fairer if everyone could work for the government. And unless you operate on some higher moral principles, which few people do, it's natural to defend your turf, to believe that what is right morally is that which offers me more security and wealth. And people naturally want safe government jobs, where the pay is remotely connected to people's desire to pay, where you don't have to constantly produce things that people want to buy. Imagine if I could get the government to force all the people in my town to pay for the expenses of my church. Well, then I could certainly relax. That would remove from me a lot of headaches, but it wouldn't be right. But you can see where people tend to set aside moral principles and to distort moral principles when it comes to their own paycheck. Now, Christians, of course, should never do this. We should always live by the work of our own hands, never forcing compulsion on anybody. But the temptation to fudge this is really strong. So we can include in one of the driving motives of socialism job security for those who live off of collectivism. But this is really just a small portion of the population. I believe if you include federal, state, and local government, that is 22 million people in America. The socialist ideologues have to actually get a larger portion of society motivated to enact socialistic policies. And they do this with the general population by one of two ways. Either by promising entitlements for them, that if we do things collectively, they too might have more security and wealth. If we split the dinner check evenly, you can order the lobster and the filet mignon, and all you have to do is pay the average. But we all know in reality, when other people pay, the system gets abused. And the general public is not easily deceived by the promises of socialism because they see their taxes going up. And they see how the government wastes money and how it wastes money on freeloaders. So the second major motive is this appeal to charity, to economic justice. Americans are generous people. And so their generosity can easily be used to deceive them in favor of socialism. Socialism, communism always sells itself as being compassionate charity for the little guy. Last week, actor Jim Carrey was yucking it up on the Bill Maher show, saying we have to stop apologizing for socialism. We need to say yes to socialism. Well, my question is this: does Jim Carrey even know what socialism is? As I mentioned last week, people confuse socialism with charity. And that's the big lie. There's this false assumption being put forth that to do charity right, it means the entire society has to do all economic activity collectively. We have to give all of our college money, our retirement money, our healthcare money, our housing money to the government for the government to redistribute. In fascism, both Mussolini and Hitler quoted this famous fascist slogan: everything within the state, nothing outside the state, and nothing against the state. You know, our generation has no idea what fascism even means. If you ask most people on the street, they would say fascism means racism. But fascism is an Italian word that means the bundle or the group. It means socialism, collectivism. It's an ideology that has absolutely nothing to do with racism. So when these social justice warriors are promoting fascism, anti-fascism, Antifa, they don't even know what they're protesting. Because if they were really protesting fascism, they would be protesting the democratic socialists. They would be protesting the DNC. The very thing that they're protesting, fascism, is the very thing that they're supporting. The world has actually gone mad. But anyway, this concept of everything within the state is fascism, and that is not a biblical view of government, because God has created various institutions with various responsibilities. The individual, the church, the family, the state, everything is not to be done by, for, or within the state. The error is to assume that the only way to do charity is by collectivism, but socialism is not synonymous with charity. It is not the only way to do charity, and it is not the best way to do charity. The Bible, even in its insistence on charity, actually speaks against government collectivism, outsourcing the responsibility to the state. And so I'd like to end on this point, made in the book of Samuel. 400 years after the Israelites entered the land of Israel, they wanted a change of government. They wanted a more powerful government, one that would fight their battles for them. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 20. And this was really the throwing off of personal responsibility. Throwing off their trust in God and getting their security that they were supposed to get from God, from the state. And it isn't just military battles that people want the government to fight for them. They want the government to fight their education battles and their healthcare battles and their child rearing battles and their retirement battles. They want the government to provide for them daycares and schools and colleges and doctors and housing and retirement. It is the throwing off of personal responsibility and giving it to the collective power of the state. And that is a sign of ungodly irresponsibility. So the prophet Samuel warns the people. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 12. If you set up for yourself an authoritative king, he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your seed and of your vineyard and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take of your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. So Samuel meant this to be a rebuke, but I'm sure many socialists today would say, hey, that would be a great thing, because the king would be creating jobs. People could be perfumers and bakers and cooks for the government. And the government can take the best fields, which in the mind of the socialists would be the best utilization of those fields. So the very thing that Samuel is rebuking here, socialists today would support. Everyone working together under and for the king. And this is what the elders in Samuel's day wanted, for the king to create the jobs. But Samuel says, chapter 8, verse 18, then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Because in practice, the ideology of socialism always brings about oppression and poverty, the feudal system. So what I want us to say is that at the root of socialism is a spiritual problem. Yes, socialism sells because it lines the pockets of the bureaucratic ruling class, And yes, it sells because the general population is often deceived by entitlements and charity, but at its root, it is the sin of irresponsibility, greed, resentment. We are not entering into a new age of economic justice. That is not what is motivating the rise of socialism. We're entering into a new age of laziness, an age of turning from God to government to take the place of God, where the people, in their apostasy from God, demand what the Israelites demanded. Give us a king to fight our battles. Jay Richards with the Discovery Institute said the following about this new rise of socialism in America. Democratic socialism is a movement in which the population gets more and more accustomed to this dependency. Rather than focusing on how we create value and wealth for ourselves and others, we focus on how we can confiscate the wealth of other people. Unquote. Well, that is the new focus in America. God also tells Samuel something even more significant in chapter 8, verse 7. God says, Samuel, they have not rejected you, they have rejected me. And that's what's really going on. When men abandon God, they are desperate for another safety net. They're desperate for some security. And they will put upon government that which God never calls the government to do, that which the government can never do. Take all of the risk out of your life, relieve you of your responsibility and burdens, relieve you of your work, and take care of you from the cradle to the grave. Government cannot do that for you. Psalm 146:3. Do not trust in princes, in mortal man, in whom there is no salvation. Now for some commentary on the culture. I want to make some observations about the big story in the news over the last 2 weeks. This woman accusing the Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh, of attempted rape back at a party in 1982. The left has come to the defense of this woman, saying she should believe, based on mere accusation alone, that Kavanaugh is guilty until proven innocent, and that the accuser is above cross-examination. And the conservative media is pointing out the lunacy of the left. Look what the left is doing. Look at the political game they're playing. This is a smear campaign. And the conservative media is right in pointing this out. But the bigger story in all this is how we're seeing the ungodly perceive justice. What it is, where it comes from, how it's to be determined. Proverbs chapter 28, verse 5. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand all things. I don't think we appreciate what the scripture is actually saying in that text. The vast difference between how the ungodly understand justice compared to the godly. How differently Satan thinks about justice compared to God. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his great work describing the Soviet system, the Gulag Archipelago, he has 3 chapters dedicated entirely to how the communist Bolsheviks, once they took over Russia, created a new foundation for law. A whole new way of thinking about justice. To survive, they had to get rid of the Christian concept of justice and replace it with a new paradigm. They got rid of all the old judges with their old concepts of justice, and they put in their own people. On page 94, Solzhenitsyn writes, the interrogations were almost never undertaken to elicit the truth, but to simply eliminate the opposition. Page 96, the first question was never, what did the person do? But what was his class? What was his origin? What was his education and upbringing? Was he part of the proletariat or the bourgeois? Because there were 2 standards of justice based upon who you were, based upon your beliefs. Justice was now pliable. And if you are aggrieved and you are oppressed by Christian values, you are allowed to persecute others. And this new justice in the Soviet Union wasn't about whether you were right or wrong, but it was really all about outcomes. If your factory failed or the harvest was poor, that was a crime because you were hurting the communist image. And there was no objective right or wrong, as people are so used to in Christianity. All there was pragmatism. What was right was what worked for the party at any given time. And you were a criminal, not because you broke a tangible law, but because you were an enemy of the people. Your thoughts could be a crime. Anything that was considered hate speech was considered a crime. On page 299, Solzhenitsyn writes, "Judges were not guided by right or wrong, but by the principles of the revolution." One judge is quoted saying, "We are guided not by the laws, but by our revolutionary conscience." And page 308, Solzhenitsyn writes, "After the revolution, for 4 years, there were no law codes. They had thrown out the Tsar codes, and they had not composed their own. Don't tell me our criminal courts ought to act exclusively on the basis of existing written norms. We live by the process of revolution. A tribunal is not the kind of court in which fine points of jurisprudence and clever stratagems are to be restored. We are creating new law, new ethical norms." And also, no matter how much is said about eternal laws of truth, justice, etc., the party has to get rid of those because we know how dearly those laws have cost us. In other words, they hated the eternal laws of justice because those laws contradicted the agenda of their revolution. The new law even stated that there is no need to clarify whether a defendant is guilty or not guilty. The concept of guilt is an old bourgeois concept which must be uprooted. On page 100, Solzhenitsyn writes, "In 1937, a Russian philosopher taught that it is never possible to establish absolute truth, but relative truth only. So we don't have to be absolutely certain someone is guilty for someone to be guilty. And we don't need to look for absolute evidence, for they can say different things at different times. So a judicial ruling is based upon one's own conclusions and the party's sensitivity to truth." Page 128. "The ideology of communism, of which they boasted so enthusiastically, turned Russia upside down, destroying its foundations, trampling everything it held sacred underfoot." So that was 50, 60 years ago. But does this all sound familiar? We're seeing today signs of this new form of justice in America among leftists. It doesn't matter what you've done. What matters is if you're politically correct. And it all depends upon your identity, whether you're of a certain political party, whether you're of a certain race, whether you're of a certain gender. And according to critical theory, there is white people truth and there is black people truth. And we are seeing how the left has this new perception of justice. They don't understand justice because they have separated themselves from God. Justice has been moved off of the foundation of human rights and has been moved onto a new foundation, a foundation of equity. What is just is whatever makes people equal in outcomes, not what protects life and liberty. And you'll get all sorts of sophisticated arguments claiming that justice is non-justice and non-justice is justice. And I'm planning a YouTube on this in a couple of weeks where I explain this whole thing in detail. But the Kavanaugh hearings are exposing something here very insidious. The kingdom of Satan has a very different view of justice. You think that justice is the same for all. It really isn't. In the kingdom of Satan, down is up, right is wrong. To quote George Orwell, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. So picture the kingdom of Satan and his followers as living in a universe that is the moral, photographic negative of God's moral universe. If you understand this, you will understand what is happening in this world, because most people have no idea, they don't even realize the degree of the opposition to God, the wanting to overthrow everything that is of God. Well, thanks for taking the time to make God and country a part of your discipleship in the Word. Next week will be part 3, the final program on socialism, and I hope to tie up some loose ends on that program. Until next time, may God richly bless you as you continue in His Word.